Before I explain my case, I'm going to explain what communism is as to dispel any and all misdefinitions, equivocations, and revisions to the meaning of the word. Communism is a political, social, and economic philosophy that seeks the establishment of a stateless, classless, moneyless society where the means of production are democratically owned and controlled by the workers. We communists seek the emancipation of labor from capital, the abolition of private property, the establishment of social ownership over the economy, and an egalitarian society where you and your labor is the ultimate expression of who you are rather than what you own and consume. Communist philosophy is not a monolith, however. There exists two primary schools of thought within the communist left: Marxism and anarchism. The two are not mutually exclusive either. It is possible to be both a Marxist and an anarchist. Libertarian Marxists are a thing. But wait, the liberal will say. Weren't communist governments violent totalitarian dictatorships where nobody had any freedom and everybody was miserable? To which I say, the first socialist countries to emerge during the 20th century were indeed very autocratic. However, there is nothing about communist philosophy that says that you can't have a liberal democratic process at the helm. Democracy and socialism are not mutually exclusive, quite the opposite. For example, you have the presidents of Chile, democratically elected in 1971, Salvador Allende, who was a democratic socialist who was overthrown by a CIA-backed coup. You had a populist left-wing president of Brazil, João Goulart, who was also overthrown by a CIA-backed coup. And then you have Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, who are also democratically elected socialists trying to peacefully transition Venezuela's economy to socialism, only to suffer coup attempt after coup attempt. Thankfully they have failed, but as of now they are being strangled by US sanctions. Well, geez, it's almost like the autocratic siege model of 20th century socialist countries was the only way that you could withstand the might of the world's #1 capitalist imperialist superpower, the United States. But I digress. Let me ask you some questions, viewer. Do you want to live a long, healthy, and happy life? Do you want to see that your friends, family, and neighbors go on to live long, healthy, happy lives? Would you like to live in a world where there's no more sickness, hunger, or disease? Do you agree that the goal of an economy should be to meet human desires and needs without destroying the planet? If you're a reasonable person, you have probably answered yes to these questions. And if your answer is yes, then excellent. I'm glad that we agree. So how do we go about achieving a society where we are all surviving, thriving, and living long, healthy, happy lives while maintaining a balanced load with our habitat? The question is an economic question. It's about managing and distributing resources. Economics is the foundation of our survival. It's how we get our needs met, what grants us access to use values, from coffee mugs and smartphones, and ultimately the playing ground upon which we all participate in society. So it logically follows that in order to achieve these needs, we need an economy that is designed deliberately with these things in mind. We need an economy that can guarantee its people work, healthcare, food, shelter, education, and entertainment. It must guarantee work as to maximize the number of people participating in society, as well as productivity, healthcare as to allow us to live long and healthy lives, food as in what we need to subsist on, shelter as in a roof over our heads, education as a means to maximize the potential of each individual as well as increase the knowledge pool in society, and entertainment as a means to escape reality when need be. All of these things are crucial components to the maximization of human potential and the realization and actualization of freedom of both the individual and the collective. And believe it or not, these means can be met and achieved within the here and now using modern technology. As the productive forces advance, we're able to produce more, create more wealth, and with these advancements, we could pay people significantly more while reducing their workload, shortening the work week, achieving more and more with less and less, granting people more leisure time along the way so that they can do less alien labor and do more unalien labor. On top of all that, we can increase the wealth of everyone in society as a whole. Sounds like a win-win, doesn't it? A real dream come true, right? Why is it that the post-industrial digital nuclear space age, the work week is still a grueling 40 hours? Why is it that we subsist on meager wages and many of us are but a paycheck from destitution? Why is there all this poverty amongst plenty? Well, the answer is that more pay, guaranteed jobs, and shorter hours contradict the interests of the people who actually own and control the economy, the capitalist class. Under capitalism, it is private ownership that reigns supreme. They decide who gets to participate, when and where resources are allocated, the policies and the laws of liberal governments, all of the important land, the means of production, the means of communication, etc. And the goal of capitalism as a system is to achieve profits. And the profit motive does not necessarily coincide with meeting human need or preserving the habitat. When you understand this, it is really a wonder that the world's most advanced and developed country, the United States, has a crumbling infrastructure, polluted water supplies in our midst, a garbage education system that's only concerned with getting people jobs, steadfast declining wages in spite of productivity being at an all-time high, and alienated youth, and thousands of people dying every single year of preventable illnesses. All these things are externalized costs that the public is forced to pay as a result of the capitalist system. Remember, this is an economic mode predicated on exploitation, so every dollar they have to pay you, or to the government in taxes to fund infrastructure and the social safety net, every law or regulation they are forced to abide by ultimately takes away from their profit margins. So they bribe the government with millions of dollars in lobbying money to pass bills and legislation in their favor, oftentimes at your expense. Your loss is their gain, and the more that they can impose austerity and undermine the social safety net, the more that they can gut the commons, the more that they can outsource labor to the third world, the more that they can inundate you with non-stop advertising specifically tailored to take advantage of your animal psychology, the more that they can exploit you in the environment, the more profits that they can ultimately reap. Keep in mind that the whole point of private ownership is to derive more value out of your investment than what you put in. What this means is that the key to becoming rich is not hard work, it is in getting others to work hard for you. It is in the taking advantage of people's vulnerability so that you may enrich yourself. And as time goes on, they have continued to enrich themselves more and more, as now 26 individuals have the same net worth as half the total human population. 26 people have just as much wealth as 3.8 billion. The wealth disparity that we endure today is worse than that of ancient Egypt between the slaves and the pharaohs. As a result of this system, 13% of the planet's population is starving in spite of the fact that we produce enough food to feed 10 billion people globally. 80% of humanity lives on less than $10 a day, while the top 1% owns half the planet's wealth. 90% of humanity breathes toxic air. On top of all of that, we are in the middle of a mass extinction event because environmental sustainability goes against what this system needs in order to function. But it doesn't have to be this way. We could end world hunger, uplift the third world, provide everyone with a decent standard of living, and reconcile the damage done to our habitat. But only if we change the way that we do economy, so that rather than prioritizing the profits of a few, we prioritize the needs of the many as well as the planet. What this means is that we must directly build this into the economic structure. And since it's going to be a long time before we are able to completely dissolve the state, class, and money, in the time being we should be fighting for a switch to socialism. Socialism has become a buzzword since the Cold War thanks to the bourgeois propaganda apparatus redefining it to effectively mean when the government does some stuff, as well as redefining communism as to mean when the government does all of this stuff. But allow me to give you the actual definition. Socialism simply means workers' control over the means of production. It means rather than having factories, farms, infrastructure, and the means of communication all owned privately, they are owned jointly by society as a whole. In a Marxist context, for an economy to be truly socialist, it needs two things. First, worker-owned cooperatives over traditional private businesses, and two, state planning over traditional free market production. Let's briefly discuss worker-owned cooperatives. Under socialism, all businesses are jointly owned and controlled by the workers. Rather than all of the fruits of the labor being centralized into the hands of the CEO, executive board, and shareholders, the wealth is instead decentralized and spread out more evenly amongst everybody in the company. The co-op model eschews the traditional top-down model of private business in favor of a more egalitarian model. Now, there are different methods as to how to organize workplace democracy. Some of these examples include, but are not limited to, number 1, direct democracy, where there is no central leadership, and rather than electing people at the helm, the group collectively makes decisions on their own. Number 2, representative democracy, where the group elects a bureaucrat or representative to positions of authority to make decisions on their behalf. Number 3, meritocracy, where candidates are chosen to higher positions of authority or decision-making with respect to their experience in a given field. And number 4, sortition, where candidates are chosen to higher positions of authority at random from a pool of employees. Cooperatives have a number of advantages over traditional private firms. Number 1, co-ops are much kinder to their employees. Rather than being driven primarily by profits and having to rely on a competitive market to incentivize wage growth, co-ops are actually capable of providing workers benefits, training, security, and substantially more for their labor than a traditional firm, as the profit motive is no longer the primary driving force of the institution. Gone are the days of the bourgeoisie trying to gyp workers on their benefits and dodge paying them overtime or fire them for not working hard enough. Number 2, co-ops are more stable than traditional firms. There is literature out there that suggests that worker co-ops do not fail at the same rate as conventional firms during startup. According to the organization Cooperatives UK and data taken from the Office for National Statistics, after tracking the health and survival rate of firms started up in 2011 over a 5-year period, co-ops have a survival rate of 80% within the first 5 years, while traditional privately owned firms have about a 44% survival rate. Number 3, another advantage to co-ops is improved workers' productivity. According to data from the Democracy Collaborative, productivity in companies under the Employee Stock Ownership Plan, or ESOP, saw 2% faster growth per year in sales, employment, and productivity than those same companies would have had without the ESOP. Another report from 2010 by the Cass Business School in London found employee-owned enterprises were between 9 and 19% more productive than their privately owned counterparts. Employee turnover rate is also lower in cooperatives, and longevity in cooperatives is superior to that of a traditional private business. Well, geez, it's almost like when you give your workers good wages, training, job security, and actually treat them with some dignity, they tend to want to stick around and give back. Where cooperatives fall short is in their ability to expand. Capital as a system is good for this due to its propensity towards accumulation. Growing a cooperative isn't as easy as growing a private firm. In addition, banks are less likely to give out loans to cooperatives for startup in spite of the fact that they are significantly more resilient to failures than private firms. And finally, cooperatives require workers' participation. It puts a great deal of responsibility in the hands of the workers, as now they are directly or indirectly involved in the operation and decision-making of the company. The price of freedom is unrelenting vigilance. Anyways, I think we have talked enough about the first primary characteristic of socialism. The second primary characteristic is central planning. This means that rather than having free market competition, where companies are battling each other for market share by offering cheaper, higher quality goods or better services, you instead have a systemic, concentrated effort towards production and innovation. This isn't to say we get rid of markets and trade outright, but trade should only be done out of necessity. What we should be working towards in the long term is a fully planned economy where the market and trade are obsolete. Using modern communication technology, there is no reason why we can't monitor, manage, harvest, and distribute goods and resources on a societal scale devoid of markets. And the reason for this is because within markets exist contradictions that I think we as a society could do without. Some of these contradictions include planned obsolescence, intrinsic obsolescence, the crisis of overproduction, the prospect of co-ops competing with each other, and the falling rate of profit. So it stands to reason that the backbone of the economy should be operating according to plan. This also includes technological innovation. Innovation, after all, is a communicative process, and the more people that are able to participate in research and discovery, the more accessible that information, the more technological development can occur with a rapidity and further increase the amount of wealth in society. So for example, rather than having, say, 20 private firms on a competitive market who are all incentivized to keep secrets and hoard proprietary knowledge so that they can maintain their market edge over their competitors, working against each other rather than with each other, to say, develop an automobile, we instead have 20 cooperative firms collaborating on the project so that they can share their knowledge, make the most technologically advanced automobile that they possibly can, so that they can benefit as well as the rest of society. At this point, my more skeptical viewers might be wondering if there are any examples of central planning working, to which I say, indeed there are.
But because these socialist planned economies sprung up a century ago under much harsher material conditions, oftentimes at siege with other countries, without modern communication technology, and some degree of cultural backwardness, it stands to reason that these first socialist experiments were the worst. But even then, there are elements of these countries that are worth recognizing and appraising them for. So without further ado,
let's talk about the USSR for a moment. Before socialism, Russia was an irrelevant backwater and a fledgling empire. Here, you have a country that went from being a backwards, semi-feudal third world country to a nuclear industrial superpower within roughly 2 generations' time, developing with a rapidity far superior to that of its capitalist counterparts. The countryside was electrified. The periodic famines that plagued rural Russia for centuries had finally come to an end. Life expectancy rose, literacy rates rose, healthcare, housing, jobs, and good wages were guaranteed to all of its citizens. They were the first country to eliminate the gender pay gap and the first country to reach the space age. And mind you, this rapid development didn't happen under a vacuum. Conditions were far from ideal, as the Russian people had to endure and contend with
a brutal civil war, a famine, another famine, forced collectivization, yet another famine made even worse by forced collectivization, Stalinist purges, a devastating world war.
And in spite of the fact that everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong, they still pulled through and made incredible strides in social, economic, industrial, and technological progress with the kind of rapidity never before seen in human history.
The swift development of Soviet Russia, at least during the former half of its existence, was driven by a combination of terror and populism. On one hand, you had a growing police state, the authoritarian government, and a strongman supreme leader at the helm, and on the other hand, you had the high morale and pioneering spirit of the class-conscious Russian people. Socialism did indeed succeed in improving the living conditions of the Russian people. Annual consumption per person increased. Average wages more than quadrupled from 690 rubles in 1927 to 3,047 rubles in 1937. And contrary to stereotypes about socialism causing famine and starvation, average caloric intake consistently increased throughout the life of the USSR. Industrial output increased substantially under the 5-year plans. Iron production increased 5-fold, petroleum production tripled, cement's production tripled, electrical power production increased by an order of magnitude, coal production quadrupled. These sharp increases in industrial output were made possible by central planning. Rather than letting the forces of production and industry be guided by blind profit motive, instead, the planners set high targets for the factories to meet, and resources were allocated with a deliberate effort to modernize the country as fast as possible. Soviet Russia was also at the forefront of scientific and technological development. The number of contributions that Soviet scientists made to the realm of human knowledge are vast. Here's a quick list of inventions that came out of the Soviet Union. And this economic and technological development was made devoid of a capitalist class. As it turns out, when you don't have a group of greedy owners at the helm to waste resources on stock buybacks, rent-seeking behavior, advertising, dividends, and wasteful lavish lifestyles, it tends to free up a great deal of resources towards more productive and innovative endeavors.
In addition, unlike the United States, which hasn't been invaded since the Revolutionary War, where growing food is far from a challenge since the countryside isn't a snowy tundra, and had the luxury of having hundreds of years to develop peacefully, the Russians achieved all of this without the profligate rape, land theft, genocide, colonialism, and slavery that the United States employed over the protracted period of its own development. The Soviet Union, for all of its flaws, blunders, and excesses, was a glorious experiment as it was the first time the working people seized control of the economy and designed a social system with the deliberate intent of taking care of its people. And there is a great deal to take away from their successes and failures. Central planning has time and time again proven itself superior to traditional free market. For all of the capitalist apologist talks about the innovation and how capitalism created the smartphone, it's interesting how they do not compute that the technology that goes into the smartphone, from its touchscreen to its microprocessor to the lithium-ion battery, were all developed in the public sector using state-funded research. In other words, it was society that shouldered the burden of developing that technology, and the private sector that took it, appropriated it, and turned around and sold it back to us. The majority of our technological innovation comes from the state sector, from weapons to advanced computer technology, energy infrastructure, cures for diseases, and so on. Because you see, as technology grows more sophisticated, it tends to take longer and longer to advance further breakthroughs, and that kind of research generally takes decades in funding. So as time goes on, that kind of money being sunk into research for decades will not guarantee the capitalist immediate returns on his investment or investments in the long term. And that's just the innovations that can be commodified. There is a great deal of technology that exists at present that could be utilized which would solve a litany of problems, but it doesn't happen. And the reason for this is because that technology can't be commodified. Solar, wind, tidal, and nuclear energy, for example, are something that you build once and save some maintenance here and there. That's it. Little to no human labor goes into the production of this renewable energy in the long run. But coal and fossil fuels require human labor for repeat harvesting over the ground. And since human labor power is how the capitalists derive their surplus, this means that green energy isn't profitable like coal and petrol is. Whether you acknowledge it or not, apologist, this is the testimony, the silent admission by the bourgeoisie that state planning is superior to traditional free market capitalism. And all you have to do is look at the most highly developed capitalist countries to see the superiority of planning. The more technologically advanced a capitalist country becomes, the more the rate of profit falls as the wealth and capital continue to become more concentrated, the more its mode of production begins to resemble that of socialism. Neoliberalism isn't the only reason why America's manufacturing base is gone, as the majority of the functions that were once fulfilled within factories by monkeys have all been taken up by robots. And it isn't just the factory that has been transformed. We have been set on a path that is taking us towards automated kiosks, self-driving automobiles, warehouse robots, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence. With the press of a button, the labor of 1,000 men can be performed by a fully automated assembly line. Capitalism cannot handle this mode of production as it derives its life essence from human labor power, the only thing that ever creates new value. With a production process devoid of human labor power, a future capitalism itself is being driven to in search for new avenues of competitive advantage. This system is marching towards its own destruction. We are steadfast reaching a point of technological unemployment, the lumpenization of hundreds of millions of people, the limits of infinite growth on a finite planet, an ecological disaster, and the prospect of World War III around the corner as the United States deliberately takes steps towards escalation with China and Iran. It doesn't have to be this way. The capitalists are indeed powerful, but there's something that exists that's even more powerful than they are. And that's us, the working class. The very people that they exploit, constantly lie to, and send off to go die in pointless wars and pin against one another, people like me and people like you, are the very same people that they depend on. They need us, but we don't need them. It's not the capitalist that paves the roads, or builds the cars, or builds the houses, or serves the food, or cooks, or cleans, or heals the sick, or builds machines. It's the workers. All of the wealth and value that exists in society today is a byproduct of human labor. So does it not make sense that the resources should be shared and distributed to everyone? How can we honestly call ourselves a civilized society if we can't even guarantee people food, housing, work, education, or healthcare in a day and age when we can split the atom? How can we call ourselves a civilized society when we are willing to tolerate a system that produces such gross inequality and profligate waste? Doesn't capitalism at this stage seem like sort of a death cult when this system is willing to apathetically sacrifice millions of sick and starving people around the world upon the altar of profit on a yearly basis? Is peace really possible in a world where we have a military-industrial complex that profiteers off of war? Do you really think that with escalating tensions between US, Russia, and China, and the fact that America is flirting with the notion of World War III, that a system predicated on exploitation, competition, and by extension warfare is really a system fit for the creation of a precondition of peace and prosperity on planet Earth? Do you really think that the way the global events are panning out right now, that there's really a future by the end of this century that capital comes out on top? A number of events are coming, that capital, a system only concerned with profits, is fundamentally incapable of coping with. It's going to come crashing down, and it will take most of humanity with it if we let it. There have been revolutions in the past, people, but before we were guided by blind fate. Well, not anymore. Marxism, socialism, communism is about humanity recognizing its collective best interest and taking destiny into our own hands so that we can reconcile the struggles of today and usher in a future brighter than anything anyone could possibly imagine. We're at a crossroads, people. The choice is yours. Socialism or barbarism.